The band was halfway through the opening number when Johnny Carson did something he hadn't done in 30 years of broadcasting. He raised his hand. Not for a laugh. Not for a pause. But to stop everything. The music cut mid-note. Doc Severinsen's trumpet hung in the air, the last echo dissolving into a silence so thick you could feel it through the television screen. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or hold their breath. Most chose the latter. Because when Johnny Carson breaks protocol, when he stops the machine of late-night television mid-flight, you know something extraordinary is about to happen. This is the story of that night. The night a single song changed everything. It was April 1987, a Tuesday taping at NBC Studio One in Burbank. The Tonight Show had been a fixture of American life for 25 years, and Johnny Carson had become more than a host. He was a ritual. Families arranged their evenings around him. Comedians measured their careers by whether they got the call to sit on his couch. Presidents sought his approval more than editorial boards. But on this particular Tuesday, the routine was about to shatter. Backstage, 40 minutes before airtime, Carson sat in his dressing room with a letter in his hand. It had arrived that morning, postmarked from a small town in Nebraska. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind that comes from someone who doesn't write letters often but needed to write this one. The envelope was addressed simply, "To Johnny Carson, from a father who lost his son." Carson read it 3 times. Each time, his jaw tightened a little more. The letter told the story of a young man, 23 years old, who had died 6 months earlier in a car accident. He had been driving home from his first real job interview. He'd gotten the position. He never got to start. His father wrote that the last thing his son had done before leaving that morning was watch a rerun of The Tonight Show. He'd laughed at Johnny's monologue. He'd done his impression of Ed McMahon's laugh. He'd told his father, "If I ever make it big, I want to be on that show." The father wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't requesting a tribute or a mention. He simply wanted Johnny to know that his son's last moment of joy had come from something Johnny had created. And in his grief, that meant everything. Carson folded the letter carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of his jacket. He didn't tell the producers. He didn't mention it to Ed. But when he walked onto that stage that night, something in him had shifted. The monologue went exactly as planned. Jokes about Reagan. A bit about taxes. The audience laughed in all the right places. But those who knew Johnny well, who had worked with him for years, noticed something in his eyes. A distance. A weight. After the monologue, Carson returned to his desk. The first guest was a comedian making his 3rd appearance, riding high on a successful HBO special. The interview was smooth, professional, full of the controlled chaos that made The Tonight Show feel effortless. But it wasn't effortless. It never was. It was precision disguised as spontaneity. As the comedian segment wrapped, Carson glanced toward the band. Doc Severinsen stood ready, trumpet in hand, his signature flamboyant jacket catching the studio lights. Doc had been with Johnny since 1967, 20 years of shared stages and unspoken understanding. They didn't need words. A look was enough. But that night, Johnny gave Doc a look he'd never given before. Doc caught it immediately. His eyebrows raised, a silent question. Johnny gave the smallest nod. During the commercial break, Johnny walked over to Doc's platform. The crew kept working, adjusting lights, shuffling cue cards. No one paid attention to the host and bandleader having a quiet conversation in the corner of the studio. Johnny pulled the letter from his pocket and handed it to Doc. Doc read it standing there, trumpet still in his left hand. When he finished, he looked at Johnny and simply said, "What do you need?" Johnny's answer was quiet but clear. "Play Shenandoah?" Doc blinked. Shenandoah wasn't on the playlist. It wasn't a Tonight Show song. It was slow, mournful, the kind of melody that belonged to a funeral or a sunset, not a late-night comedy show. But Doc didn't question it. He nodded once and returned to the band. When they came back from commercial, Johnny didn't introduce the next segment. Instead, he stayed seated at his desk, hands folded, looking directly into the camera. The red light blinked. They were live. And Johnny Carson, who had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of controlled television, was about to let go of the controls. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice softer than usual. "Before we continue tonight, I'd like to take a moment. I received a letter today from a father in Nebraska. I'm not going to read it to you. It's private. But it reminded me of something we forget in this business. We forget that behind every television screen there's a life. A person with hopes, losses, moments of joy, and moments of unbearable pain. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, what we do here, in this studio, gives someone a reason to smile. Even if just for a moment." The audience was silent. This wasn't part of the show. This wasn't in the script. Ed McMahon shifted in his chair, unsure whether to respond or stay quiet. He chose quiet. Johnny turned toward Document. "Doc, would you play something for me?" Doc raised the trumpet to his lips. No introduction. No count-in. He simply began. The first note of Shenandoah drifted through the studio like a memory carried on wind. It was a song most Americans knew without knowing where they'd learned it. It was the sound of longing, of rivers and distance, of things lost and things still hoped for. Doc played it slow, with a tenderness that made the trumpet sound almost like a human voice. And Johnny Carson, the man who had interviewed presidents and movie stars, who had made America laugh for 30 years, sat perfectly still behind his desk and listened. His hands remained folded. His expression didn't change. But those who were there, in that studio, swore they saw something glisten at the corner of his eye. The song lasted 3 minutes. 3 minutes of live television with no jokes, no banter, no commercial urgency. Just a man, a trumpet, and a silence that held an entire nation. When the final note faded, the studio remained quiet. Then, from the back row of the audience, someone began to clap. Slowly. One pair of hands. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire studio was on its feet. Not the polished, enthusiastic applause of a talk show audience. This was different. This was reverence. Johnny stood and walked over to Document. He shook his hand, held it for a moment longer than usual, and whispered something the cameras couldn't pick up. Then he returned to his desk, looked into the camera, and simply said, "Thank you." They went to commercial. Backstage, the producers didn't know what to do. They just aired 3 minutes of unscheduled content. Advertisers had paid for a comedy show and gotten something else entirely. But the phones didn't ring with complaints. Instead, they rang with something unexpected: gratitude. The father in Nebraska was watching. He called the network the next morning. He didn't speak to Johnny, but he left a message with the receptionist. It simply said, he understood. In the weeks that followed, letters poured into NBC. Hundreds, then thousands. People wrote about their own losses, their own moments of unexpected connection with a television show that had, for just 3 minutes, stopped being entertainment and became something closer to communion. One woman wrote that she had been sitting alone in her living room, grieving the recent death of her husband, when Doc played that song. She said it was the first time she'd cried since the funeral. And somehow, knowing that Johnny Carson, a man she'd never met, had created space for that grief made her feel less alone. Carson never spoke about that night in interviews. He didn't need to. The moment existed on its own, preserved in the memories of those who witnessed it and in the lesson it left behind. What Johnny Carson did that night wasn't revolutionary in the way we usually think of television breakthroughs. There were no special effects, no celebrity cameos, no viral moments designed for replay. What he did was far more radical. He trusted his audience with silence. He trusted them with stillness. He trusted that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do on television is stop performing and simply be human. Doc Severinsen would play Shenandoah again over the years, but never quite the same way. Every time he raised the trumpet for that song, he thought about the letter, the father, the son who never got to chase his dream. And he played not for an audience, but for a moment that couldn't be replicated, only remembered. Years later, after Johnny had retired and The Tonight Show had moved on to new hosts and new eras, a journalist asked Doc about the most memorable night of his career. Without hesitation, he answered, "The night Johnny stopped the show." The journalist asked what happened. Doc smiled and said, "If you were watching, you already know. And if you weren't, no explanation would do it justice." That's the thing about moments like that. They don't belong to television. They belong to the people who experience them. And in a medium built on repetition and formula, that one night reminded everyone watching that the most powerful moments are the ones you can't plan. Johnny Carson didn't stop the music to make a statement. He stopped it because a father had written him a letter, and that letter had reminded him of a truth he'd always known but sometimes forgot, that behind every screen, there is a life. And sometimes, acknowledging that life, even for just 3 minutes, is the most important thing you can do. Subscribe and share this story, because the lessons Johnny Carson left behind are the ones we still need today. The lesson that humanity matters more than ratings. That silence can speak louder than jokes. That sometimes, the best thing you can do is stop everything and let a single song remind us all why we're here. The trumpet is quiet now. But the memory remains. There's a detail about that night that few people know. After the show ended, after the audience had filed out and the lights were being dimmed, Johnny didn't leave the studio right away. He sat at his desk, alone, the letter still in his jacket pocket. A stagehand who'd worked The Tonight Show for 15 years later recalled seeing him there, just sitting in the semi-darkness, looking at the empty audience seats. The stagehand almost walked away, thinking Johnny wanted privacy. But then Carson called out, "Hey, come here for a second." The stagehand approached nervously. Johnny Carson rarely spoke to crew members outside of professional necessity. But that night was different. "You got kids?" Johnny asked. "2 boys," the stagehand replied. 7 and 9. Johnny nodded slowly. "Tell them you love them. Every single day. Even when they roll their eyes. Even when they pretend they're too old to hear it. Tell them anyway." The stagehand promised he would. Johnny handed him a folded $20 bill. "Buy them something. From me. Tell them Johnny Carson says life's too short not to tell the people you love that you love them." That stagehand kept that $20 bill. Never spent it. Framed it years later with a handwritten note explaining where it came from. Because that night, he'd seen something he'd never seen before. Johnny Carson, the man behind the curtain, the human being underneath the carefully constructed television persona. Doc Severinsen, too, carried that night with him. In his later years, when he gave interviews about his time with Johnny, he'd often pause when asked about memorable moments. Most people expected him to mention celebrity guests or historic news events. Instead, he'd talk about the night they played Shenandoah. "Johnny taught me something that night," Doc once said in an interview. "He taught me that sometimes the most important thing an artist can do is get out of the way. Let the moment be what it needs to be. We spend so much time trying to entertain, to perform, to fill every second with sound and motion. But that night, we did the opposite. We created space. And in that space, something sacred happened." The father from Nebraska never met Johnny Carson in person. But 3 years after that broadcast, he sent another letter. This one was shorter. It simply said, "My son would have been 26 today. I watched the recording of that night again. Thank you for remembering him, even though you never knew his name." Johnny kept both letters in a drawer in his Malibu home. When he passed away in 2005, his family found them, along with dozens of others from people whose lives had been touched by that single, unplanned moment of television history. What makes this story remarkable isn't just what happened that night. It's what it represented. In an era when television was becoming increasingly calculated, when every second was measured and monetized, Johnny Carson proved that the medium could still be human. That it could still surprise. That it could still heal. The producers never scheduled another moment like it. They couldn't. Because moments like that can't be scheduled. They can only be recognized when they arrive, and honored by people brave enough to let them exist.